Welcome to our deep dive today, and let's talk apostrophes. You think you know them, right? Simple, maybe not. Turns out there's a whole lot more to these little guys than we learned in school.
Absolutely. The apostrophe is a fascinating example
Really?
of how language evolves over time,
Yeah.
and often in messy and unexpected ways.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to unpack today. We'll dig into its history, its quirks, and maybe even come away with a newfound appreciation for this oft misunderstood punctuation mark. I, for one, had no idea that the earliest apostrophes weren't even used to show possession. Did you know that?
Not many people do. It's a common misconception way back when. They were primarily used to signal that letters were missing from a word, sort of shorthand. You see, instead of walked, you might have seen walked.
Like a typo.
But on
Wow.
purpose, in a way, yes. But even that wasn't consistently applied. Sometimes letters were omitted, seemingly at random, without any real grammatical reason.
You're kidding. So it was a bit of a free-for-all back then.
Pretty much. Take, for example, Robert Herrick, a 17th century poet. He wrote a line that read, "What fate decreed time now has made us see. Why the apostrophe in has?" No one really knows for sure. It wasn't until much later that the possessive use of the apostrophe, as in the king's crown, became the norm. And even then, there were decades of debate about the correct usage.
Okay. That's fascinating, but it begs the question, how did we go from using apostrophes to indicate missing letters to using them to signify possession? How did that evolution even happen?
One popular theory was the his theory, which suggested that the S after an apostrophe was a shortened form of his, so the king's crown was once the king his crown.
That makes a strange kind of sense, like a little linguistic shortcut.
Exactly. However, language historians have largely moved away from that theory. The more likely explanation lies in the mists of Old English. Back then, they altered words to show possession by adding suffixes like s. So sinning, meaning king, morphed into synongies to indicate possession.
Hold on, so you're saying the apostrophe we use today could be a remnant, an echo of that ancient form. It's like a tiny time capsule embedded in our words.
Precisely. And it highlights just how much language evolves over time, carrying these echoes of the past in its structure.
Okay, that makes the rules about apostrophes suddenly seem much more forgivable. If even the way we use it has changed so much, it's no wonder people still get tripped up.
That's a great point. And it's not just about us modern folk grappling with grammar. Even the literary giants of the past weren't immune to a little apostrophe anarchy.
Oh, really? Tell me more. Which literary giants are we talking about?
Shakespeare, for instance, in his first folio, published in 1623, apostrophes for possession were only used about 4% of the time.
4%. Shakespeare, what were you thinking?
Right. And then we have Benjamin Franklin, who in the same article flip-flopped on the possessive is versus its. If these intellectual heavyweights struggled, then who are we to judge ourselves too harshly?
It is reassuring, isn't it? It proves this whole apostrophe conundrum isn't a matter of intelligence, but one of evolving language use. But we're not off the hook yet. What about how language is still changing? What are we seeing today with apostrophes?
We're witnessing a fascinating shift, even at an institutional level. Take, for example, brands like Harrods and Barclays, both of which decided to drop the apostrophes from their names.
So it's not just about grammar anymore. There's a whole other dimension to this.
Absolutely. This isn't just about pedantic rules, but about branding, marketing, and a world increasingly dominated by the digital sphere. Think about it. In the age of the internet, having a name that's easy to type, search, and remember is critical. Apostrophes with their extra keystrokes can complicate that. Not to mention the global aspect. Not every language utilizes apostrophes in the same way English does, so going apostrophe-free can create a more globally unified brand identity.
Wow. That's fascinating. So we've gone from missing letters to possessive cases to marketing strategies, all thanks to this little mark. What I'm hearing is that context is key. What did you say?
Precisely. Apostrophes are still out there shaping language. But the how and the why have taken on new dimensions, mirroring shifts in our communication styles and technologies.
You mentioned earlier that even the way we write decades is changing. What's the story there with the apostrophe?
Ah, yes. Another prime example of those shifting sands. Traditionally, we'd write decades like 1990s with an apostrophe before the S.
Right, just like we'd say the 1990s fashion to talk about the fashion of that decade.
However, more and more style guides and publications are moving away from that, opting for 1990s instead, without the apostrophe.
Why is the change? It seems counterintuitive.
Part of it is consistency. We don't use an apostrophe when talking about centuries, the 1900s, for instance, so why do it with decades? It's also about recognizing that 1990s isn't possessive in the traditional sense.
You're right, we're not talking about something belonging to the 1990s, but rather the decade itself.
Exactly. It's more of a descriptive term, referring to a specific decade.
So, are we headed toward an apostrophe-free future? Will our punctuation marks stage a revolt?
That's the million-dollar question. It's hard to say for sure. Language is a living, breathing entity, always evolving. New technologies and communication styles emerge, and with them come changes, often reflected in our punctuation. While some uses of the apostrophe might fade, others could emerge.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they do amidst all this change?
Don't be afraid. Don't let these shifts intimidate you. The key is to stay curious about language. Pay attention to how it's used in different contexts. Read widely. Consult style guides when in doubt.
So, embracing the evolution rather than fearing it. I like that.
And remember, even if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. Even the greats like Shakespeare and Benjamin Franklin couldn't agree on apostrophe usage all the time.
It's comforting in a way. We're all part of this long, messy, evolving conversation about language.
Precisely. Every email, every text, every note we write, we're adding to that conversation. We're shaping the language in our own small way.
That's a lovely way to think about it. This deep dive has been eye-opening. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
The pleasure was all mine. It's always a joy to talk about the nuances of language.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the surprisingly complex world of the apostrophe. Remember, the next time you see this little punctuation mark, don't just see a rule to follow. See a tiny time capsule, a symbol of centuries of linguistic evolution. Until next time, happy writing.